Welcome back. Some Singapore manufacturers are looking to adjust their operations after the latest US tariff increase. They're also holding off on making major changes to where they produce their goods. Meanwhile, others are investing in productivity improvements to offset higher costs. The Singapore Business Federation says it's received a handful of queries on the situation. Eugene Chow with more.
Singapore firm TE Jia is known as the world's largest producer of spring roll skins. It also makes other Asian food products like samosas and dim sum for consumers around the globe. The US is one of its key markets, making up 20% of its current revenue. With 3 production plants in Singapore supplying mainly the Americas, its US customers will now face higher duties when importing its products.
They are definitely very concerned with the new tariffs increment because it essentially means a higher cost of serving the USA market, because we are actually looking about the entire supply chain from the manufacturers in Singapore down to the distributors and then eventually the customers in the USA. So with the new tariffs, it actually increased the cost much more significantly than previously.
The firm adds the jump from 10 to 12.5% puts Singapore exports at a disadvantage. The US kept the 10% rate for other regional neighbours such as Malaysia and Indonesia. But the food exporter has not made a call on outsourcing production, as it involves long-term decisions that cannot be made overnight. Instead, it plans to further improve productivity through automation, demand forecasting, and other operational efficiencies while maintaining product quality and supply. Within a month or two, these products will reach customers in the US, but it will cost about 14,000 Singapore dollars to ship one of these 40 food containers over there. The firm says the new wave of tariffs adds another layer of cost pressures on top of the already elevated ocean freight rates. Not every manufacturer is affected in the same way. This medical device manufacturer says it does not expect any immediate impact from the tariffs, despite the US market making up well over half of its business. The firm says it's because customers depend mainly on the consistent quality and regulatory compliance of medical components.
Typically, the approach when looking at and confronting tariffs is that we look at this from a longer-term perspective, not making short-term changes, but rather focusing on long-term effects for our customers and for the market overall.
For now, both companies say they are keeping a close watch on developments. They are also working with customers while monitoring the evolving tariff landscape.
Now, around 1 in 3 Singapore exports to the US now face a 12.5% tariff. But figuring out what businesses actually owe is anything but simple. First, is the product exempt? The list is long, spanning semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and some electronics. If it isn't exempt, businesses then have to work out its customs value. And that's not simply the sale price. Freight, insurance, and other costs can also come into play. And only after all that can businesses calculate the final tariff bill. Then there's the question of where a product actually comes from. Many Singapore exports are made with parts and materials sourced from several countries. So simply being assembled or shipped from Singapore may not be enough. Businesses have to determine the product's country of origin based on where it was made and how substantially it was transformed here. That matters because it determines whether the product qualifies as Singapore origin in the first place and which tariff rules apply. Now, tariff and origin rules also vary from country to country. For products made with inputs from several markets, simply being assembled in Singapore may not be enough. Businesses may need to establish where the product underwent substantial transformation. That can determine its country of origin and ultimately which tariff applies. Now, to help us understand this better, we have with us Associate Professor Goh Puay Guan from the Department of Analytics and Operations at NUS Business School. Prof. Goh, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, we looked at all the hoops companies have to jump through just to determine how much to pay. How challenging is it from the company's perspective to determine how much they have to put out?
Sure. So if you look at some of these products that I mentioned, there's a think about dual use. So in typical customs declaration, we may there's an international standard that is called HS code, and companies will use that HS code in their declaration. And it's an international standard, but different countries will have different variations of that. In the case of the US, some of the products might be classified, as semiconductor type imports or non like industrial imports, and therefore that the tariff rates will then be different or applied differently. And in order to prove that, then you need to show the appropriate documentation for that, right? And to show that it's used by the customer and how it's being used and the industry that it goes to. So it increases the amount of complexity that you need to do in order to show and demonstrate the compliance and sort of provide the documentation to prove.
And speaking of that complexity, since the new tariffs were announced, has there been any more clarity with regard to exemption rules and also the customs value up to date? I
think it's still pretty much the same as what was originally declared, at the 23rd or 24th July time frame. I think since then they have probably updated a little bit more clarity, but I think the rules are pretty much there. The issue is more of determining where it falls into the buckets. And, it's not always easy because, besides the type of products, it could also be that it goes to distributors, for example, and then the end customer is not always clear or the end use is not always clear. So they actually have to be able to break up, who are the different customers they are using and what is the usage for.
Yeah, can you tell us more about these gray areas that you think might still be very confusing for companies right now? How can these areas be resolved and more clarity be sought?
Sure. So one example is the multiple type of customers, right? Or if it goes through a distributor, the end usage may not be clear. The other one is, of course, what you mentioned earlier with the tracking of the origin of the product. So in a case like this, if it's a company that's distributing products, they may not necessarily know the details of where the products come from. Even if it's a manufacturing company, the different supplier tiers, so normally for manufacturers, we are able to track first tier suppliers quite easily, but the second tier, that means the further upstream, second and third tier, it may be harder to get information on what they are doing. And therefore now there may potentially be a requirement to trace, all the way back in order to prove, one is the origin. Secondly is to show that there is no usage of the forced labor, right? And it doesn't mean that just because it's paying at a higher rate that it can go through. So the documentation can still be asked for. It's not that they always have to do, but in cases where the customs actually ask for further documentation, then the companies actually have to show this.
Yeah, what is that going to cost the companies though? And also what kind of interim measures can they take while awaiting further guidance to reduce these costs?
Well, I think so a lot of this is operational, but I think, in terms of what the companies can do, they probably are already writing to the US Customs, that's one, to actually clarify on their product nature and what is the category of HS code that their products fall under, and therefore that hopefully will give them some clarity moving forward on where to declare, how to declare their products. Of course, they can also work with their customers to get documentation to help to prove their case. So all this requires some effort and time. The other thing that probably they can do is that if they are not so familiar with this, I think in the trade associations in Singapore, they actually provide some advisory service on the trade tariffs and rules, and therefore some of these consultants in the trade advisory can actually provide information of this to their the trade association members, for example.
Now, which industries do you think are most likely to feel that impact first? And are there sectors that are somewhat cushioned from this?
Sure. So if you look at, I guess the first level, I think was mentioned just now about the differential tariff between 12.5 and 10%. So, the first impact will be on price companies that face more price competition and their products are more general products. Therefore, when there's a price competition, it's harder for them to be able to differentiate themselves because they now are potentially facing a higher tariff level. So that's the probably immediate impact for the lower value type products companies. The other area is probably on companies that are distributors that may not necessarily be able to track their products to the level that that is required, and therefore now they have to spend more time to look for the documentation and to be able to prove all the origin and stuff like that. And while it takes time, then in the interim, what do they do, right? In order to clear the customs, and that may also potentially mean lost business because the cargo gets stuck there, or the importers in the US may not buy from such companies.
Professor, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Okay, thank you.
I've been chatting with Associate Prof. Goh Puay Guan from NUS Business School.